of the arguments you often hear against universal basic income is that it strips from us the dignity that comes from working. That the human condition needs dignity, and there is dignity in work, from a hard day's work to a good day's pay. And if we give people something for nothing, if the state gives people something for nothing, does that make us supplicants at the mercy of those in control? What do the experts think?
If the jobs we were creating were jobs for the purpose of giving people dignity, they would not be the jobs that we have today, by and large.
Says that about wealthy people who live off their assets and dynastic families such as the Bushes in the United States. You might have heard these guys, George and George Bush. Their family has been wealthy in the United States from the 1600s. And you don't find them saying, oh, we lack the dignity of work because we've always had our basic needs met.
Basic income is a foundation for dignity in work. I think basic income, like many other goods in society that we need in order to function, are a foundation for our engagement in society and for dignity in work. I don't think there is a contradiction at all.
There is dignity in creativity, and there is dignity in work. There is dignity possible in work, but there is not dignity guaranteed in work. So we all very well know that not all work brings dignity. And a lot of work is pretty hard, it's pretty tough manually. And if you look at the history of work, it was life-defeating rather than life-enabling, sweatshop labour and everything else. And currently, job dissatisfaction is actually, sadly, quite high. So whilst work can bring dignity, it is not guaranteed that work will bring dignity.
Very important in people's lives. And I think we know that because of how hard people work to get a job when they don't have one. At the same time, I think that dignity comes from being treated as a human being. Dignity comes from having the freedom to make a choice to work or to not work, or to work at the kind of work that you consider important.
But quite often the ones who are complaining it would remove dignity of work are not wishing to do any of the jobs that they fear might be taken away from the people who would be getting the basic income. Work, for me, needs to be reimagined and repurposed in the 21st century. I think we're still rooted in a lot of our context, certainly here in Scotland, in that kind of post-war perception of a 9-to-5 job for life where work was the best route out of poverty. Actually, paid employment, sadly, is no longer such the case. We see the growth of in-work poverty, so people who have jobs but actually are still really struggling. We've seen the huge growth of precarious work that can lead to a lot of insecurity in people's lives. And also, I think work itself, that concept of how we spend our lives has changed. People have caring responsibilities, they volunteer, they move between different jobs and different responsibilities. And yet the support structures we have in place don't represent that. And I think that's why when you see the kind of social security system we have in the UK in terms of universal credit, it has to force people to look for work, because actually the kind of jobs that are being offered quite often are not financially beneficial and certainly are not bringing dignity or happiness into people's lives.
And you also don't hear people complaining about wealthy people doing that. It's only the dignity of work for the poor. We have a work ethic for the poor and the middle class, and then we have no such ethic for the wealthy, the people who we all have to go to work for. When we fulfill our obligation to this work ethic, the people that we work for don't have a likewise obligation to the work. They have the money that they can retire and spend the rest of their life. And I tell you that the worst thing you can do to a worker is to put them in a position where they have no choice but to take one of the jobs available. Very often, every single one of those jobs that they're eligible for is terrible. If you want to help workers, give them the power to say no to a job with bad wages and bad working conditions. That's what's good for workers.
The problem you have, I suppose, if people are fearful of life, of their basic subsistence, of their health or status in society, then they get stuck in unproductive and unhealthy relationships and jobs. And then what we have is not a dynamic society. We have not healthy individuals in society. we have a number of studies. In fact, I did a study, I designed a survey to test that. And what I found was that individual motivation, the identification with work, which was I was interested in fact, is driven by a combination of centers of security. That individuals feel more motivated and identify more with what they're doing when they have security from other sources. If you depend on one thing only, in a modern society, you tend to stagnate. And ultimately, if your prospect is losing everything, then you freeze. And sadly, the evidence we have of the, I suppose, the ultimate moral outrage is just people who get benefits taken away, or have the threat of benefits being taken away, do harm to themselves. And we have records of significant numbers of suicides or deaths following threats of or actual removal of income subsistence.
Dignity, in my view, is inherent to the human being, not conferred by some outside agency like work. So there are a lot of people who don't work, either because they're children, or because they're old, or because they're not in the labour market for one reason or another. That doesn't mean they don't have any dignity. This is, again, a philosophical issue, but dignity is inherent to the person.
So you have to ask where that dignity comes from. Why do we have dignity associated with work? And that has to do with the incentive to work, right? So if you don't feel dignity and pride in your work, you're probably not going to get hired. So people, psychologically, people have an incentive to develop this psychology, and there's a reason why our culture has kind of developed around that. But culture is very adaptable. Culture can change. People's psychology can change. There are maybe certain elements of it that can't change. So we might have to put resources into providing activities for people that give them meaning and purpose, or provide that in their lives. But that's not the same thing as pretending that they're necessarily contributing to the economy's output or something like that. I think if you treat people as inputs to the machine, then you're missing the point that the economy exists to serve the people, not the other way around.
And I well remember working at Rolls-Royce factory in Bristol, where I lived many, many years ago. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, people weren't hanging around to stay longer, and they were queuing up to run home. Because, there are other interesting things to do in life. And you ask the average retired person, actually, in most cases, they're very happy having discovered the liberty to do what they would like to do. So it does enable a lifestyle choice.
But surely you need an incentive to work. Won't universal basic income remove that incentive?
I think we've seen, certainly from the recent Finnish experiment and from the trust experiments in the Netherlands, that there doesn't seem to be a huge work disincentive associated with offering some form of a basic income. We've seen that in North American experiments. We see it in low-income countries when cash transfer programs are offered. So when we look at the kind of experiments that have taken place in Canada, there was a large one in the 1970s called Mincome. There was another attempt to have an experiment that was canceled prematurely a few years ago in Ontario, the Ontario Basic Income Guarantee Experiment. And I think the Mincome experiment was set up initially to find out what the impact would be on work effort. If you offer people money for nothing, will they stop working? That project took place in the 1970s. Governments changed and interest in basic income faded, and not very much work was done, except that they discovered that for most people, there was no work disincentive. There were two groups of people who did work less: new mothers, who used some of the stipend to buy themselves longer parental leaves when they gave birth. The 1970s in Canada, women were guaranteed 4 weeks of maternity leave, and a lot of mothers thought that was a rather miserly parental leave. The other group of people who worked less were adolescent boys, 15 to 20-year-olds. And they worked substantially less. A few years ago, I was interested in health outcomes, and I went back to look at that data. And I found a nice increase in high school completion rates for those young boys. So what actually happened was that families who previously had encouraged their sons to become independent as soon as they could legally leave school were able to support their sons in school just a little bit longer. I was able to track people down in the health database, the Medicare database. I found that people who received a basic income compared to people who didn't, a matched control, were hospitalized less frequently. In fact, 8.5% less frequently. They visited family doctors less often. They reported better health overall. So, I mean, I think we've seen some pretty good outcomes from basic income experiments in Canada.
But might universal basic income make us lazy? Like in that movie WALL-E, in which the machine does all the work for us and we just become slobs. Is that what universal basic income will create?
I usually like to address this question with this story that was told by Erich Fromm, which was last century famous psychologist. And he did talk about universal basic income in the 60s. He didn't talk it in this name. I think he talked about a guaranteed income of some sort. And he said, well, what would happen? So if you were to introduce a universal basic income tomorrow, it's like if you go to a child that has always had his candy delivered on a condition of cleaning his bedroom. So if you raise the child saying, okay, you clean your bedroom and I give you candy, you clean your bedroom and I give you candy. And one day you go to this child with a bag of candies and you just go, here, you don't have to do anything. What is most likely to happen is that the child will get sick on the candies, okay? Because initially it's like, oh my God, what is happening? But after this initial like crash of sugar, it's like, oh, okay. I can have these candies anytime. So, you know, why is that a big thing? And then you would invest that same time and energy that he was spending on cleaning the bedroom in order to get that candy to do other things. You know, oh, okay, maybe now I can go out and, you know, play with my friends, or I can make this drawing, or I can. So this is like very basic psychological terms. And then the other part of this argument is, you know, it's a very moral authoritarian perspective. You know, this why do we feel that we need to control what do people do, how do they spend it? You know, it's in a way, it all revolves around this concept of deservingness and undeservingness, which is very unfair and is very skewed towards a certain class of people. Mm-hmm. And there was this beautiful quote of Bertrand Russell. It was like, well, we are so judgmental, you know, with people, you know, buying booze and, you know, smoking cigarettes if they come, you know, from a certain socioeconomic background. But we are not if these same behaviors are instead carried on by the wealthiest, you know. So why is it okay to have a lazy drug addict wealthy individual, and it's not okay to have a lazy drug addict unemployed person? So, and this, you know, like, what are our standards of judgment? What are the main causes of addiction and addictive behavior? So if you do live in a deprived environment, whether it's because of background or things have happened in your life, if you're constantly worried, stressed, and frustrated that you might lose your job, or that you're looking for a job, or, well, that is like the major cause of addictions. And this, again, it's human psychology. Once you take that stress, that frustration, that stigma away, it's like you're also taking the incentive for these self-destructive behaviors.
In our next video, we look at another advantage of universal basic income, and it lies with pitchforks. Is there a risk that society could be torn apart by social unrest? Events that make, for example, what occurred on Capitol Hill on the 6th of January seem mild in comparison. And could universal basic income provide the solution, the means by which society can retain its cohesion? Find out next time.